Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever in the world you are. This is Wilbert Mukori on Talking Points. If Mnangagwa and Chamisa make up, sanctions will be lifted, and we will all live happily ever after. This is based on an article written by Trevor Ncube. Imagine President Emmerson Mnangagwa and opposition leader Nelson Chamisa embarking on an international campaign against sanctions. That move alone will be a sign of political maturity and patriotism and will contribute to the national common purpose and unity. But to do so, the two would need to agree on what sanctions mean to Zimbabwe. It's an interesting article, but sadly, it totally misrepresents the reality on the ground. Because in the article, and I'll continue reading it, he says many in the opposition, including Chamisa himself, argue insincerely that all sanctions are targeted and have no effect on the men on the street. Their view is that sanctions are a fitting punishment for those in the ruling party who have played a big role in Zimbabwe's worsening misfortunes. They purposefully ignore what scholars have long unveiled, namely that sanctions are a form of warfare, fourth generation warfare. See Nicholas Mulder, the economic weapon, the rise of sanctions as a tool of modern war. According to Mulder, sanctions are intended to cut off a country from all access to the international economy and wait for it to exhaust itself or succumb to political revolution or social collapse. He further postulates economic sanctions have long been considered a non-violent deterrent, but ironically, they've become a tool of modern warfare. It is clear that Mr. Ncube not only agrees with Senora Mulder that sanctions are a weapon of war, but more significantly, that sanctions imposed by the West on Zimbabwe are a weapon of war. Chamisa is obviously aware of this lethal effect of sanctions on Zimbabwe, but because he sees them as a weapon to fight his way to the State House, fair chance that he can team up with Mnangagwa to fight for their removal. Ncube continued. It is important to remind the reader here at this stage who Trevor Ncube is. He signed off as Alpha Media Holdings chairman. This is the biggest independent print and electronic publication in Zimbabwe and owns Mail and Guardian in South Africa. The media is often considered the fourth pillar in a healthy and functioning democracy, the other three being the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. The media is tasked to inform and educate the people. Democracy as a government of the people, for the people, by the people, will not work unless the people are informed. In a country like Zimbabwe, the importance of the independent media is even more important than ever, given that it has the added task of countering the ZANU-PF propaganda from the dominant public media. By describing the sanctions imposed on Zimbabwe as weapons of war, was giving Mr. New was giving the traction, was giving traction to the ZANU-PF propaganda lie that sanctions are the root cause of Zimbabwe's economic meltdown. Zimbabwe's economy was already in serious trouble long before the sanctions were imposed in 2001. The country adopted the IMF and World Bank sponsored 1990 to 1995 Economic Structural Adjustment Program, ESAP, precisely because the economy was in trouble. When that failed to revive the economy, another ESAP program, the 1995 to 1999, was adopted, but that too failed to revive the economy. It was at the end of the second ESAP that the IMF and the World Bank stopped giving Zimbabwe any financial assistance because the country was failing to service its debt. Many other financial institutions followed IMF and the World Bank's lead, sending the country's credit rating to junk status. Sanctions bar banks from doing business with targeted countries, argued Trevor Ncube. Indeed, when the West imposed sanctions on Zimbabwe, Mugabe was very dismissive, claiming he would do business with the East. His Look East mantra did not last long because the Chinese too stopped giving Zimbabwe financial assistance for the same reason. Zimbabwe was not paying its debt, as the Chinese were obliged to tell Mugabe himself to his face. High-level corruption is a tax on the already overburdened taxpayer. Apart from taking from the poor and giving to the politically elite and politically connected, high-level corruption has created a subculture of corruption everywhere. Corruption is a national cancer that is crippling provisions of basic services to the poor and marginalized. It must be decisively dealt with, argued Trevor Ncube. After going to town about economic hardships brought on by sanctions, it is a damn squid to then give the real root cause of Zimbabwe's economic meltdown and political paralysis a passing coverage. One more key point Mr. Ncube failed to point out is that sanctions is one of the tools used to pressure the ruling party to concede the need for meaningful democratic change, including the holding of free, fair, and credible elections. Whilst the economic and political UN sanctions imposed on the white-ruled Rhodesia cause far more economic hardships than the current West sanctions, all the black nationalists called for their imposition. They argued that the economic hardships were worth the sacrifice to help end the white colonial oppression. We are now being asked to believe that sanctions will not help end black oppression. Imagine President Emmerson Mnangagwa and opposition leader Nelson Chamisa embarking on an international campaign against sanctions. That move alone would be a sign of political maturity, patriotism, and will contribute to national common purpose and unity. The sheer naivety of that statement beggars belief. I would expect that from one of the brainwashed Zimbabwean, not a leading intellectual and trailblazer. The West will never allow murderous demagogues like Mnangagwa and or incompetent sellouts like Nelson Chamisa dictate their foreign policy. ZANU-PF and MDC cooperated, at least in the sharing of the spoils of power during the 2008 to 2013 GNU, where they were of one accord in the call to lift the sanctions. The West ignored the call because there was no evidence of ZANU-PF dismantling the dictatorship. None. Interestingly, the economy registered a 12% growth in 2009 to 2010, although sanctions had remained throughout the GNU, largely because the GNU scrapped the Zimbabwe dollar, forcing the hyperinflation to fall from the dizzying heights of 500 billion%. Proof the economic meltdown was not caused by sanctions. A few sound economic policies were enough to restore some sanity in the economy and generate some economic growth. The economic recovery registered in the first year of the GNU fizzled out when it became clear that MDC, much less ZANU-PF leaders, were going to implement any democratic reforms to dismantle the ZANU-PF dictatorship. Although the European Union 2018 Zimbabwe Election Observer Mission issued a damning report on those elections, the EU foreign ministers decided to lift all the sanctions imposed on Harare. That has not translated into any meaningful economic recovery because Zimbabwe is still a pariah state, plagued by mismanagement, corruption, and lawlessness. Zimbabwe is heading for new elections next year, 2023. And there is already overwhelming evidence to show ZANU-PF is rigging the elections. There's not even one reform recommendation that has been implemented. There's no verified voters' roll. Cases of ZANU-PF orchestrated political violence are on the rise, etc., etc. The suggestion that sanctions will be lifted and Zimbabwe will enjoy peace and economic prosperity if only Mnangagwa and Chamisa kissed and made up, regardless of the reality of the economy of the country remaining a pariah state with rampant corruption, etc., is laughable, especially when the foolish suggestion is coming from someone who should know better. Still, the foolish suggestion explains why Zimbabwe is in this seemingly intractable economic mess and political paralysis. If Zimbabwean intellectuals are so flippant about the country's economic and political crisis, why should the rest of the world care when we clearly don't care? Thank you. Good night.